They say revolutions are born not in moments of triumph, but in the crushing silence of desperation. Imagine a country where markets echo with empty shelves, where the currency's numbers seem like a cruel joke, where mothers whisper prayers not just for bread, but for safety. In late December 2025, that country, Iran, awoke to something unprecedented. What began as economic protests over prices and inflation quickly became something the world hadn't quite seen in decades. A nationwide challenge to the very legitimacy of the regime that has ruled since 1979. By January 2026, streets in more than 200 cities across all 31 provinces were alive with chants not for reform, but for revolution. From Tehran to Isfahan, from the bazaars to universities, millions lifted their voices and their anger. Some chanted for the return of a monarchy some had never lived under. Others spoke of a new Iran, free of clerical rule. But the state did not retreat. It lashed back with brutality. Security forces opened fire in cities like Rasht and Fardis. Markets burned. Mass shootings claimed thousands of lives. The web went silent as the government cut off the internet, isolating Iranians and the world from each other. This was not a fleeting protest wave. This was structural rupture, the sort of seismic stress that shakes a system to its core. Analysts now describe it as the largest, most sustained anti-government uprising since the Islamic Republic's founding. Into this maelstrom came a new war, not only against the regime's people, but now against its enemies abroad. In late February and early March 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes targeting Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure, decapitating senior commanders and hitting strategic assets. A bomb fell on the center of clerical power and changed everything. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the ultimate guarantor of the regime's authority, was killed in an airstrike. Across Tehran and other cities, crowds cheered in disbelief, honking car horns and toppling symbols of a man whose word had been law for decades. Supreme leader was announced, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the late Ayatollah. This succession infuriated much of the population, with protests erupting even from within families. Criticism was swift, public, and deeply personal. Now a critical question looms. How long can Iran's regime keep fighting, both against its own population and against external military pressure? To answer that, we have to understand the many fronts on which this complicated struggle is unfolding. Inside Iran, the regime's main strength continues to be its security apparatus, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij militia. For decades, they have been the guardians of the system, crushing dissent with an iron fist. But the widespread protests of 2025-26 have revealed the limits of fear as a tool of governance. For every crack in a bazaar stall shuttered by force, there were dozens more opening in defiance. Yet the unity of the security elite has not completely fractured. That is the reason the regime has not immediately imploded, even under the weight of unprecedented repression and external assault. Economically, the story is one of collapse. Sanctions reimposed in recent years have drained Iran's oil revenue, bankrupted state coffers, and sent inflation soaring above 40%. Basic goods have become luxuries for ordinary families. The rial, once a proud national symbol, is now a punchline in exchange markets. Under these conditions, even a regime accustomed to hardship finds its foundations cracking. But that is only one part of the picture. On the battlefield of regional geopolitics, Iran still has formidable capabilities. Its drone production studios can reportedly produce thousands of unmanned aerial vehicles per month. Iran has launched waves of missiles and drones aimed at disrupting key energy corridors like the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point through which a fifth of the world's oil and gas passes. These are not acts of a spent power. They are acts of a state trying to leverage what it can to inflict cost, to signal it still matters, even as sanctions starve its economy and strikes shave away at its military assets. So, can Iran sustain this? Yes, for a time, but not indefinitely. In military terms, the regime is playing a war of attrition. It still has missiles, drones, proxies, and a geographic advantage at home. But many of its missile stocks are finite. Its air defenses have been degraded by sustained strikes. Every day of conflict eats away at launchers, technicians, and the industrial base that keeps weapons ticking. And while external conflict rages, inside the population's anger continues to grow. The internet blackout that once fragmented dissent is being circumvented where possible. Every massacre, every family loss, every execution adds fuel to a fire that authoritarian repression cannot extinguish forever. The choice facing the regime's leaders is stark. Press the war machine harder, tightening domestic repression but alienating more of their own people, or seek some form of bargaining, a path that risks eroding the very ideological foundations they have spent decades building. There is no middle ground that promises stability. And that is why scholars and strategists today speak of multiple scenarios rather than a single destined outcome. Some foresee the regime clinging on, bloodied, diminished, isolated, like an old general refusing to yield ground. Others see fragmentation, where ethnic tensions and regional uprisings break the country into uncontrollable fronts. Still, other analysts argue the war could drag on in intermittent phases, spikes of conflict followed by fragile pauses, until everyone involved runs out of political will, ammunition, or both. What is clear is this: Iran's leadership has already crossed a threshold no regime wants to face, one where legitimacy is no longer assumed, but violently contested. And once that threshold is crossed, time becomes both an enemy and an unpredictable ally. History is full of forces that seemed immovable until they weren't. The question now is not just how long Iran's regime can keep fighting, but how long the world will watch before something new, for better or worse, finally takes root.